Hi, everyone. I hope that you are able to hear me. My name is Troy Blackwell. I will be the moderator for today's event. This is PRSA's Diverse Dialogues Conversation. We are having a conversation on the LGBTQ experience in public relations. Just so everyone is aware, we have Zach, who will be providing sign language interpretation for those who need it. I am going to introduce our fellow panelists. Then afterward, we will take Q&A from the audience. So to start off, guys, my name is Troy Blackwell. As I mentioned, most recently, I was the head of press logistics for Tom Steyer. Previously, I worked for Senator Kamala Harris's presidential campaign, also worked for President Obama in the White House Office of Public Engagement. Diversity is extremely important to me. So I sit on the board for PRSA Tri-State and the Black PR Society. So our panelists for the evening, our first panelist is Debbie Ebalobo. She is the Global Communications Director at the Coca-Cola Company, and she is a board member of many of the resource groups within the company, including the LGBTQ resource group and the Asian resource group. As a gay Asian person who immigrated from the Philippines, she wanted to kind of break the stereotype of what a traditional trajectory would look like. So she stopped studying toxicology and actually pursued a degree in communications. She graduated from the University of Georgia, was the first in her family to graduate. And she was able to do so with the support of organizations like the LeGrant Foundation and PRSSA, which is the student version of PRSA. She also lives in Atlanta with her girlfriend, Lexine, and her puppy, Kobe. Our second panelist, and feel free to wave, guys, to the panelists, feel free to wave. Our second guest is Ben Finzel. Ben is the president of RENEWPR, which is a DC-based national PR firm. They focus on environmental issues, energy, and LGBTQ communications. RENEWPR is also a founding partner and part of the Change Agencies. The Change Agencies is the first national network of independently owned PR firms that focus on LGBTQ communications. Previously, Ben was the co-founder of FH Out Front, which was a communications practice at an international public relations firm, one of the first. And he is the founder of the DC Family Communicators, which is a professional network of LGBTQ communication professionals in DC. Last but not least, we have Rich Ferraro. Rich is the Chief Communications Officer at GLAAD. There at GLAAD, he oversees press, news, the rapid response, and the creative departments. He also leads the social media team, which just recently in 2020 was an official honoree at the 2020 Webby Awards. Congrats to them. He's also been at GLAAD since 2008. And in 2015, Rich received a Daytime Emmy Award for being part of the MTV and local documentary Laverne Cox Presents the T-Word. He currently sits on Twitter's Trust and Safety Council and Facebook's network of support. So I welcome our panelists for tonight's evening. So I'm going to start off with a set of questions that we have for the panelists. But I really want to open it up to the panelists from your view of the PR profession. How has the profession changed for the LGBT community and practitioners throughout the years?
I can jump in. I wasn't sure if I was going to go first or not. Hi, everyone. Hi, Troy. And thank you, PRSA, for having me. It's really exciting to be here. I want to talk about what I've seen change in terms of D&I for the PR industry. But first, I just wanted to give a little heads up about who GLAAD is and what we do here, because it ties right into that quite nicely. So GLAAD's an LGBTQ, and let's spell out the letters, right? So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBTQ organization that advocates. I always say we don't lobby in courtrooms. We don't do our lobbying work at GLAAD on Capitol Hill. We lobby in the court of public opinion, and we work on forwarding acceptance of LGBTQ people. And we do that using PR through the media. So we're a storytelling agent in the LGBTQ community. We start our morning every day at 9:30 a.m. with a news briefing, and that's when our news teams decide which issues we should be pushing out to mainstream news outlets. We also do a lot of great work behind the scenes in Hollywood to make sure that representation is strong and diverse and intersectional in Hollywood. But where, to get back to your question, Troy, a lot of our work these days is around working with global brands. And I think from when I started in PR to today, I've seen such an uptick in interest in working on LGBTQ issues from across brands. I remember when I started at GLAAD a million years ago in 2008, before Barack Obama was elected president, we used to set up war rooms with some of our corporate partners when they would begin work, when they were ready to launch an LGBTQ inclusive campaign, or when a film studio was ready to launch an LGBTQ inclusive movie, because they were worried that they would get pushback from anti-LGBTQ people and from the general public, and boycotts and petitions. Now, on the flip side, I think that brands that don't include us and aren't engaging with the LGBTQ community are starting to get, they're under scrutiny for why are they not being diverse and inclusive. And you look at brands like the Hallmark Channel, which last December, when they should have been celebrating the holidays and their busy season, they had to deal with a PR crisis that we kind of worked with them in a behind the scenes way on, when they first said that the Hallmark Channel would not air an ad featuring two women getting married. And then 48 hours later, because of the power of LGBTQ Twitter, quickly reversed that. So now we're seeing that brands that are not inclusive, they need the war rooms these days. So I think there's a big opportunity right now for LGBTQ inclusion. There's a lot of questions that brands have and a lot of interest and appetite, and that's really a welcome and amazing change.
I'll go next, and I'll say, Rich, you know, as somebody who, you know, I grew up in the Philippines, 98% Roman Catholic. I didn't even know what gay meant, right, until I moved abroad. And then seeing visibility was so important. So the work that GLAAD does and organizations like GLAAD are so important to being normalizing this, you know, who we are to people that won't necessarily get to interact with gay people or may not know gay people. But what I'll say is, I want to go back to when I was a student. So the senior year of college, I actually became the president of the PRSSA organization at the University of Georgia. And it was the largest PRSSA organization in the country. And then I had just come off the presidency of the Asian American student organization to the PRSSA organization. I remember one of my first meetings, and it was a sea of just white faces. And I remember thinking to myself, we need to do something. And I started with the board, you know, some initiatives for diversity, and I started to see an uptick. And then I went to the dean and said, can we do this for the journalism school? Because it's important for broadcast, it's important for every storyteller to have diversity. And I, you know, as I left college and started my career, I assumed that work continued. But recently, now that I'm at Coke, we, you know, 2 years ago, I think we went back to the university to recruit interns. And though there was a slight uptick, I'll say that, you know, it wasn't a tremendous uptick, right? And I think to myself, like, if the funnel is still not getting larger for diversity, there's a reason for that. And I think to myself, like, as an Asian person, my family did not even know communications was a profession that you can go in, let alone thinking that that it would be sufficient for a living. And as I think about minorities and even visibility, right, showcasing different professions that somebody could have is really important. And I think that, you know, seeing leaders who are diverse, who are gay, who are all those things will create more desire to move up. And I think that's super, super important. Additionally, I think to myself that, okay, so women already have a barrier, right? Even in PR, there's usually a ton of women in PR, But once you start getting higher, right, there usually is a cliff that happens. Then you add a layer of race, and then you add a layer of sexual identity or gender identity. All those things get more and more complicated. So I'll say that, you know, we have made progress, but I think we need to do so much more. We need people of color first, and then on top of that, we need people of color who are gay in leadership positions, being communicators, because when I think about, if you take a step back, in marginalized communities, homophobia and transphobia are so rampant, and we need to address those issues. And we can't address it, you know, with just, we need intersectionality to be part of that conversation. So to answer your question, we made progress, but we have so much more to go.
So I guess that's me. Thank you to PRSA, as Rich said, and Troy, thank you for being the moderator. I did want to just make one little tweak to something you said about me. So the change agencies, which RENEWPR is a founding partner of, is not just focused on LGBTQ communications, we focus on multicultural communications, which to the last point about intersectionality is so important. So we're 6 agencies. We look at African American, Asian American, Hispanic, and LGBTQ communications. And that's sort of why we can say we're the first and only national. So I didn't want to misrepresent myself there. I figured I better throw that in there. But in terms of the question, I'll date myself, not a little, but a lot. I got my first job in PR at Edelman in 1995. So it's been a minute. And I'll say to Debbie's point, it's better than it was, but we have a lot of work to do. And I feel like we've been saying that every year for a long time. I'm not sure we've made progress, but I'm not sure why we haven't made more. I'll say, I think about this, when people ask me this question, I think about it in terms of waves or cycles. So the first was the early 90s, when Bob Whittick and Wes Combs really started the modern gay PR industry with Whittick Combs Communications. And they really set the tone for everybody else. The second wave was the early 2000s when, frankly, me and a whole bunch of my colleagues at Fleischman Hillard, including that gentleman with the map behind him, Rich Ferraro, started the first global PR practice at a global firm called FH Out Front. And a few other firms started expanding. And then the third wave was in the 2010s when people like my friend Stephen Macias at MWW did the same thing. And then other firms kind of started reinvigorating that model. I'm not sure that we're in a fourth wave or a cycle right now. If we are, it's a lot more diffuse and it's got a lot more players, which is a really good thing. I hope we are, but I think the problem with saying that it's waves and cycles is that you have to think about what happens in the trough of the wave, right? Or the down part of the cycle. And what we've seen and what I've seen in my career is not much. We've got the exciting part when we're doing stuff, but in those troughs or those down cycles, there's not a lot happening. And that's part of the problem. And we've got to graduate from this up and down process to really consistent engagement. And that's going to take the leadership of the agencies, all of them, the big ones, the small ones, the medium ones, the independents, the global, whatever, to not just fully embrace LGBTQ people, but also people of color and women at all levels. And particularly, and I think this is what Debbie was getting at and where Rich was going, particularly people of color and women who are also LGBTQ. That's a connection that has not quite been made yet. So that's where I think we have to go.
Awesome. You guys brought up a lot of really good points about intersectionality within the LGBTQ community itself. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit more about what is the responsibility that PR plays in social movements, and what do you think we can learn from some of the other social movements like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement? Any one of you guys can go first.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Okay, thank you, Rich. Well, I think intersectionality is such a beautiful thing. The intersection of identity is when understanding can be made. It's when catalysts to change can occur. It's a beautiful thing. And as I think about the movements that you mentioned, Troy, I think to myself, okay, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think oftentimes we think in such a myopic time frame and okay, this is happening now. but you need to zoom out and think about all the things that have happened before and what will happen in the front, right? So as I think about my personal experience, I think of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, okay? And then right after that, the Immigration Act of 1965. I wouldn't be here unless that was passed. And that was passed because Black folks were able to march and demand equality. And I think to myself, like, I wouldn't be here unless those people stood in the front and tried, you know, and then got incrementally better. And as I think about even racial justice, I think of this week was the anniversary of the death of Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American, and he was murdered because people thought he was Japanese. And the murderers were let off with a $3,000 fine, and they never went to jail. And I think to myself, like, inequality anywhere is inequality everywhere. And I think we need to think about it like that. And I think the point you made as it pertains to the responsibility, I think PR or any communicator, it's about telling the truth, being transparent, and continuing to provide those resources for people. I think that's so integral, especially with all the noise that's happening, right? I think as any communicator, that needs to be super important. And I think on top of that, you need to champion the voices, right? That matter. That's why the GLAADs of the words are so important, because my experience as a gay Asian woman is not the same as Troy's or Ben or Rich. And we need to be cognizant of that, of people's experiences and what that brings to the table.
You want to go, Rich, or you want me?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'll go. We're also polite.
We all have a lot to say on this topic now. Go ahead.
Well, I really, after Debbie, I feel like I should just not say anything, but that was great. I think, you know, we can learn, and we need to learn, that we're all connected and we all rise together. That's something I think we kind of forget. And it's not enough to just speak up for one marginalized community on one topic. We all have to take responsibility for each other. The marches that we've seen around the country have been, you know, a lot of them have been inclusive, which is really cool, right? They weren't always that way. We're not just looking at Black people and saying, you have to speak up for yourselves. We're looking at all of us understanding that this is a broader issue and we all have to do that. And even more recently, some of the marches that have been really focused on Black trans lives matter have been just really life affirming, you know, to see that this group of people that, you know, for so long have been forgotten, right? I mean, people are killed, murdered, and we don't even know their names, you know, and they don't get news stories, they don't get attention. To see that we had folks marching for Black trans lives who were not Black or trans, that's what it's supposed to look like, right? That to be there for each other. I think as far as PR goes, I think we've got two jobs. I think we're translators and we're amplifiers. I think we translate things that others may not understand into words and images that transcend our differences. At least if we do our jobs right, we do that. And then I think we amplify important messages that may otherwise be lost in the sea of communications that Debbie was referring to a minute ago, that makes it really hard to notice anything. So I think those two jobs are really important. I don't know that they're necessarily understood or appreciated outside of our industry. I mean, if Debbie was talking about my family didn't know what communications was, I'm sure most of us on this webinar today have to explain again and again to our friends, what is it that you do every day, right? So I think, you know, that job as translator and amplifier is super important. And that might be a way to make what we do a little bit more relevant to folks who don't always understand.
Something we've been sharing with a lot of the corporate partners who we advise on their PR campaigns and on their advertising campaigns is, if you're trying to reach the full LGBTQ community, you need to ask yourself, how are Black LGBTQ people going to respond? How are LGBTQ people of color going to respond? How's the trans community going to respond to your campaign? And if you haven't asked those questions yet and addressed all of those communities, and you're trying to reach all of us, you haven't done your homework yet, and you need to do more research. And we're living in a Pride Month that is coinciding with such a needed and overdue moment for the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's a time when LGBTQ organizations like GLAAD are reminding the world that Black Lives Matter is an LGBTQ issue because there are Black LGBTQ people. And GLAAD is actually, many people don't realize that GLAAD is run, the chair of our board of directors is Pam Stewart, an amazing Black queer woman who works at Coca-Cola with Debbie, and who prides herself on making sure that GLAAD as an organization is intersectional, but as a movement, the LGBTQ community is intersectional. And I think that partners who are marketing to us need to approach D&I with an extra eye. It's not just diversity and inclusion, it's diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. And that's not only the right thing to do and the accurate thing to do, but if you don't do it, you're likely going to get pushback on social media, because queer Twitter is a force that I don't want to reckon with. And as we approach Pride too, and if your clients or your agencies are thinking about Pride, we also have to remember the roots of Pride. One, Pride started as a protest. That's why there are so many LGBTQ people too protesting this month, and that needs to continue. But our roots are in protest, and our roots are with queer people of color. Black trans women started Pride. Black trans women were at the first riot at Stonewall, and we can't forget them, and we need to honor those women like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, a Latinx trans woman. We need to honor those trailblazers, and if you're thinking about Pride, it's a really great way to be intersectional by remembering the history and working that history into your campaigns.
Yeah, you guys really touched on a lot of really good points about reaching the diversity within the LGBT community itself, especially amplifying voices of those, particularly people of color and women and trans women. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about, what do you think some of the greatest challenges are for you right now as communicators in this current time as we engage with diverse audiences? I know that there's a lot happening, with the Black Lives Matter protest. There's a lot that happened recently this past week with the Supreme Court and COVID. Just in a general sense, what do you think are some of the greatest challenges communicators are facing right now?
I think one is just that what you just mentioned, Troy, how the volume that's out there and the trying to get through, especially if you're pitching media these days, is so difficult unless you have a story that's focused on Black Lives Matter, COVID, and the other hot button issues of today, Trump being another one. But it's really hard to break through. And we had a lot of corporates that worked with GLAAD on Pride campaigns that typically would have gotten, I think, more media attention and earned media around their campaigns if they launched in another year. But one of the things that we told them, and I think as you're starting to think about your Pride campaigns, is the content itself and doing social media outreach around those campaigns, because we can't rely on earned media the way that we did. Newsrooms are, there are fewer journalists in newsrooms, and they're covering a whole lot more issues that are really hot button. So how can you create content that's going to sell itself and reach the end user? One of the good ways to do that too is to work with organizations like GLAAD, like Trevor Project, like many other LGBTQ organizations to get to the consumers. And then involving influencers is something that I've seen a lot of brands do. Instead of pitching media, they're pitching influencers to work with them on their campaigns and be the face of their campaign or share their campaign. However, I do want to, this is a great audience to remind everyone that if you're working with influencers, especially LGBTQ influencers, save some of your budget to pay them, because I think the well is going dry when we keep going to the same LGBTQ influencers and asking them to lend their channels and lend their platforms and lend their minds to create these posts without compensating them for their time. So make sure you budget for that.
One note, I think I would agree with everything you said, Rich. The one note that I would say is that also attention spans are much shorter too, right? So on top of everything that's happening, and such complicated issues too, like it's not just like one sentence to explain one issue, right? There's a complicated history. There's a complicated, it's a conversation. It's a conversation with people where you need to just listen. And I feel as if as a communicator, what we do oftentimes is distill and make it as simple as possible so that people get it, because there's so much coming at you and now the attention spans are lower. And I think that's difficult because it is such a complicated environment out there. And I feel as if on top of that, you know, yes, the pandemic, yes, Black Lives Matter, the economy, even marginalized groups experiencing the pandemic, it's different per community, right? So I think like it's gonna need to be more local, more than ever, because I think each community is so different and they're experiencing, and the issues that they're dealing with are so different, and attention spans are less. So I would say that as we think about the messages we're pushing out, we need to think about, you know, the audience, and then from there understanding what exactly is the key point, because I think it's easy to just over communicate without understanding what is the key message that we're trying to get out there.
Totally agree. I'll just add a couple thoughts. I think I made a list of 3 things in terms of challenges. I think one, taking the time to look beyond the current situation to see the broader issues that we're facing, which is really hard because the current situation seems so overwhelming, but I think we've got to keep that long view, and finding ways to really engage in solutions long-term, not just now when everyone's paying attention. And I watched a webinar yesterday that Rich did with some other folks for PRSA New York. Shout out PRSA New York. And you know, they made the point, and one that we all make a lot, which is Pride is 365, right? It isn't just June. And if all you're doing is talking about Pride in June and checking a little box, you're not doing it right. So, you know, thinking about that longer term solution. And then the last point is, and this is also tough, but that's why it's a challenge, I guess, avoiding the temptation to make right now just about us and how we're feeling. This is about all of us. And that's partly our responsibility to ensure that others understand that. So, right, I mean, it can't just be your own little bubble. You've got to think about what's going on in the rest of the world, you know, in 8 minutes and 46 seconds, for example. So I think those are some challenges. In terms of sort of the rest of it and sort of operationalizing that, I think you have to understand that the landscape has changed. It changes all the time, but particularly in the last month, it has changed. And I think, you know, we talked about intersectionality. I think we're seeing how all these things are kind of blending together, and it's no longer good enough to just include an LGBTQ person in an ad or build messaging that appeals to some of us. You really have to demonstrate in whatever communication you're doing, you know, to Debbie's point a minute ago, that you understand us and that you respect us. And as you're thinking about communications and you're thinking about how to engage folks, you've got to stop giving people a pass who are anti-LGBTQ, because it's easier than calling them out on their behavior. You know, we're not at that place anymore where it's like, well, we'll just sort of ignore the fact that this organization or this company or this group is actively supporting anti-LGBTQ causes, because that's what's causing the problems. So that's a tough thing to do, but that's a challenge we all have to sort of think about from a communicator's perspective, how to address.
Yeah, and you know, as you were speaking, Ben, I was thinking, I think sometimes I go to, on panels like this, some of the pitfalls that brands fall into, but there's a lot of opportunity, and I want to make sure that everyone watching and the agencies watching and your clients, or if you're in-house, you don't have to be scared to market to the LGBTQ community. You just have to do it the right way. And there are huge, there's buzz and earned media on the other side, and a community that is extremely loyal to a brand. We did a study with Procter & Gamble that we released about a month ago, right before June. And it was on non-LGBTQ people and how they responded when they saw us in ads. And I think if we would have done this study 10 years ago, it would have been overwhelming. They don't want to see LGBTQ people in ads. But now we're seeing that 80% of them, 80% of non-LGBTQ people have said, we're good with seeing LGBTQ people in ads. There were some other big headlines for that. One was that non-LGBTQ people were comfortable seeing LGBTQ people in ads, TV and film. Two is that those people who saw us in the last 3 months, they were more accepting of LGBTQ people. We tested them on 7 different scenarios, like having an LGBTQ family move into your neighborhood. So social good happens, right? So if you're a brand and you put us in ads, and we're visible, you're potentially growing acceptance of LGBTQ people. The last big finding from our study with P&G was probably the best for everyone on this call. The non-LGBTQ people who saw us in ads, they were more likely to support that brand. So almost 70% of them said, I'm more likely to support a brand if they put an LGBTQ person in an ad. That's amazing brand favorability and potential buying power, not only of LGBTQ people. I call it the mom effect, because I think that's what we're seeing is that my mom, who is straight and cisgender, but has a gay son and has many LGBTQ people in her family, she wants to support brands that support her family, and that includes LGBTQ people. We're also at a place where on television, our latest study at GLAAD shows that 10% of broadcast TV scripted characters are LGBTQ. That's the highest percentage ever. And what was exciting too in the last study is that LGBTQ people of color outnumbered white characters. So mainstream America, the general public, is seeing more LGBTQ people in TV. They're reading about us in the news, and now they expect to see us in ads. And just to recap that P&G study, when you put us in ads, it's going to grow acceptance. So I encourage everyone to try and do that. I'll put in the chat box too. It's glaad.org/inclusion if you want to see more results of that study with Procter & Gamble.
And then just one other thought, just to build on what Rich said. I think it's really important that we realize that the PR industry and the PR profession and all of us have a really important role to play here. I mean, what Rich just explained really gets to the heart of it. You know, why does acceptance accelerate? Because it's covered in the media, because advertisers feel comfortable putting images of people of color in ads. They feel comfortable showing trans lives in ads, right? That's how society changes. It advances through pop culture. So the work that GLAAD is doing, the work that other groups are doing, the work that Coke does with the really inspirational advertising and the outreach that you guys do, that matters. And the PR industry matters. The work we do matters. So it isn't just that, you know, there's a whole lot of us in this industry, so therefore it's of interest. We have a real opportunity and almost, I would say, our responsibility to really help advance the conversation, because the work that we do really has an impact much more broadly. And that's one of the reasons I like being in PR, actually. Not that we're doing an advertisement for PR at the moment, but.
Want to add too, I'm thinking like, as you know, I think there's also a lot of companies that often leverage movements without any type of action, right? They try and like just lean in and get all those wonderful stats that you guys mentioned. And I think more and more folks are becoming more aware and taking the initiative to learn. If you are selling to my community, if I am part of your audience and I am essentially, you know, giving you the money to continue and grow and do all these things, the expectation has changed dramatically. Whether that's within the LGBTQ community or if it's within any marginalized community. Because I think what's happened is people are now seeing that, you know, for years, images of certain communities have been utilized, but those communities continue to be marginalized. They're not seeing any impact on you know, getting out of poverty or finding better lives. And I think that's really important too. And I think as PR professionals, we have the ability, if a brand comes to us or this conversation happens, for us to also say like, wonderful, it's going to be a wonderful ad with X amount of people, but don't forget about, you know, what else you're doing outside of this advertisement. Because I think the expectation is more, which is great, because I think now brands and companies know that they can't just, you know, throw a pride logo and call it a day.
Yeah. And ads I think that they have power, and it's not just ads, PR campaigns as well. And they reach a lot of people too that might not see LGBTQ people in other forms of media. Like most of the general population is not watching Pose. I wish they would. They're not watching Drag Race. They're not watching a lot of shows that center LGBTQ people, But guess what? They're buying Kellogg's product and they follow Kellogg's on social media. So when Kellogg speaks out during Pride Month or at other times of the year, we do a great campaign with Kellogg's called Spirit Day when they go purple for LGBTQ youth in October. And amazing celebrities participate and athletes and a lot of brands. But when Kellogg's does it, when Tony the Tiger, who every mom knows, goes purple for LGBTQ youth and says he supports LGBTQ youth, that could have amazing impact on moms who have kids who might be coming out. And one other note too is Debbie and Ben both mentioned, don't just do this during Pride Month, because you're not marketing to a moment, you're joining a movement when you're involved in LGBTQ inclusion, and your brand or your clients can have huge impact in terms of our legal equality. So if you think of the historic decision from the Supreme Court last week that LGBTQ people can't be fired for who we are, which is crazy that it's 2020 and the Supreme Court is debating our dignity and whether or not we can be fired just because we're LGBTQ. Another story for another day, but brands played a huge role in that. There were 200 brands that signed a brief to the Supreme Court, and the justices listened to a lot of those brands. And I work with some amazing activists in India where being LGBTQ was decriminalized in 2018, only 2 years ago. But in the behind the scenes way, it was a lot of those brands in India and the global brands who put the pressure on the government of India and on the judges there to decriminalize being LGBTQ. So that's a real power that brands have. And as a result, you know, that brief that all of those companies signed didn't only move legal equality, but it got media as well. And it earned a lot of loyalty from our community. And just one other commercial for, as you're thinking through the best ways to and most authentic ways to market to LGBTQ people. One really important one that I stress whenever we talk with the corporate partners to support LGBTQ media outlets. Small ad buys, involving them in your media buys, involving them in your PR campaign, even small amounts go a long way to get you ads. And though that's where our community is interacting. And I mentioned at the top of this call kind of the, it's like drinking through a fire hose lately with all of the news coverage. So it's really hard for mainstream media to cover our issues. And that's unfortunate and needs to change, but it reinforces the importance of LGBTQ media. If they're not watching out for the laws that are happening on the local level and exposing anti-LGBTQ voices, no one is going to, and laws will pass that are anti-LGBTQ. So it's really important to consider supporting LGBTQ media, and they will treat you very, very well as a result. It goes a long way.
Just want to add, I'm thinking, because you talked on the media side, journalists too. I think there's a lot of organizations like the National Lesbian Gay Journalists Association as an example, right? We need to support these organizations too, because storytellers matter and perspectives matter. And if someone is reporting on something and they don't know anything about it, there's a high chance that the reporting is going to be inaccurate. So on top of the media buy, let's also support these organizations that are championing, the next generation of storytellers and who are currently in the media environment now.
Now, you guys touched on a lot of really good points. I like the fact about Pride not just being about June. Pride itself is 365 days out of the year, and especially the amplification of LGBT media and also LGBT journalists. There's a lot of overlapping there. Each of you work in a different area of PR. We have advocacy, corporate, and Ben, who is industry. The industries are responding to the ongoing social issues. So
it's a little hard to hear, Troy, but you were asking us, I'll go first. You were asking us about how we think our industries are responding to the ongoing social issues that affect the LGBTQ community. I'll say I've been interested to see how the PR industry has responded. I've been sort of watching. So, Fleischman Hiller had a big response, and I was really happy to see that, one of my former firms. I think as a rule, all of our agencies, of all different sizes, have been much more willing to speak out. more quickly than they have in the past. I think that's really good.
Correct.
But I think the issue here is the proof is not in the passion, it's in the practice. And what we've got to look for is, are all of these agencies, big, small, large, independent, whatever, are they going to carry out the promises that they've made? Are they going to realize that simply hiring more people of color is not enough if they don't have a place at the table and an ability to influence the business? Are they going to understand that intersectionality is three-dimensional, you know, and it goes all around? It isn't just a sort of a one-way street. So just as they are focusing right now on people of color, they've got to also get their house in order about LGBTQ people. And just as they focus on us, they've got to also remember what I said before, that there are Black LGBTQ people. We have one on our panel. There's Hispanic LGBTQ people. There's Asian American LGBTQ people. There's Native American, you know, and on and on and on. And in many cases, we can be both, and we all need to be included. And I think the other thing I'll say going forward is the industry has to realize that simply hiring a white gay guy or a femme lesbian is not enough. You know, they need bi leaders. They need trans leaders, people with purple hair, 5 earrings, right? Not just the preppy gays with the nice shirt. And they need to not just encourage an LGBTQ employee group and issue nice press releases during Pride Month. They've got to really demonstrate how they're giving us, all of us, opportunities to lead. And that's, I think, where we're going to see the proof in the practice.
One example that I would love to point everyone to is another Procter & Gamble one. You could tell we're close with P&G, but they're the world's largest advertiser. So it's kind of exciting that they have such a close relationship with a group like GLAAD. There's a campaign they created last December that I think kind of includes a lot of the best practices that Debbie and Ben have been sharing, and Troy as well, throughout this panel. It was called Home for the Holidays, and they filmed the transgender chorus of Los Angeles singing a sweet holiday song. And then you saw members of the chorus going to their respective homes. And going home for the holidays for LGBTQ people means a lot of different things. It might be going home to your biological family, but it might be going to an LGBTQ community center or spending the holidays with your chosen family. So you saw these trans individuals going back and what the holidays meant directly to them. It's a really compelling campaign with real LGBTQ people. And it was Ellen DeGeneres actually broke the campaign before some of her controversies. But Ellen, the kind of family-friendly brand, broke the campaign, got a lot of earned media headlines in CNN, People, et cetera. And I think what was so surprising to everyone was, one, that it featured so many transgender people. When you see trans people in the media, it's generally about news stories about violence, or it's a one-off secondary character in a TV show. And that has to change. This was an ad from the world's largest advertisers with dozens of trans people celebrating the holidays. And then also it was around the holidays, wasn't during Pride Month. Like Ben said, it was Pride 365. It was released during the holidays when typically LGBTQ people don't see ourselves in the media that often. So I think it was a great campaign. And I think it's a look at where PR can go and the impact that we can have as PR professionals, in addition to advertising professionals, to make sure that these campaigns are seen and really well thought out. And that campaign, they had GLAAD and our transgender media staff. We have a staff at GLAAD that focuses on working with brands and working with Hollywood who are trans, and they sit down and occasionally, if they're not intersectional enough, they'll bring in additional consultants who are Black trans women or folks who we don't have on staff, to make sure that they're the ones telling the stories that need to be told.
Now, as I think about this question, I think, you know, more and more I find that everything is interconnected. I know that Rich mentioned that brands are now more comfortable than ever, right? Supporting us, right? And that's because consumers, it's cyclical. And I think to myself, in today's age, consumers just expect more, and due to that, brands that tout inclusivity, they need to speak out, they need to show action. I think additionally, on top of that, I'll say that, you know, what we do externally, yes, that's really important, But what I'm seeing more and more in corporate America is within their benefits, within some of the internal employee resources, they're providing more resources, right, for LGBTQ folks. And I think that's really important, because as I think about what the next 10 years is going to look like, it's important to try and get as much diverse talent as possible. And I think corporate America understands that, because I think, you know, there's more and more studies that show the more diverse you are as an organization, the more that you're going to have success financially. And I think, you know, as we think about diversity, I think as corporations come to terms with that, they're going to change some of their internal practices to ensure that they recruit more folks like us, and more people of color, trans people, because it's important. And I think that's, you know, from one side, yes, the external piece is super important, but I think more and more what I'm seeing is also the internal practices changing to ensure that me as a person can benefit with my, you know, my partner, and not feel like I have to figure it out. But and I think to myself too, the resources within companies, I think oftentimes we think the company just does the thing, but I think the employees within those resource groups are so important, because what happens is, you know, as an LGBTQ board member of the resource group, I'll engage, you know, my Black colleague to say, hey, can we bring, you know, an African American in to talk about, that's trans, to talk to the LGBTQ, you know, like, can we just have more intersection? And I think more and more the employees are taking the initiative to raise their hand and say, what about this? And I think that's the power of ensuring that the practices of organizations are inclusionary, because the output of that is more folks doing the right thing, whether that's with a campaign or internally.
And just to chime in real quick, I know we have to move on, but I wanted to just, Debbie made me think, there are a bunch of resources out there. So in addition to groups like GLAAD, Debbie mentioned ERGs, employee resource groups. Out and Equal is an excellent resource for building an employee resource group, or managing an employee resource group, or finding folks in other companies who might be helpful to you and sort of figuring out how to do this. They can also be helpful if you're working for a PR firm. They can be helpful in terms of navigating where folks are in the industry, et cetera. The other one to keep in mind is the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce. I'm actually certified as an LGBT business enterprise by NGLCC. And NGLCC is a terrific resource for companies of all sizes who want to understand how to tap into this market and how to work with, like, making your supply chain a little bit more diverse to include us. So those are two great resources to think about, in addition to groups like GLAAD and HRC and the others. Just wanted to make sure we mentioned that.
Fantastic. That's a really good segue to our last question. I know for myself, I personally mentor a couple of other young professionals, and I consistently get asked a lot of questions about advice that I have, particularly being a person of color and being a part of the LGBTQ community. So to the panelists, for each of you, what advice would you give to an up-and-coming LGBTQ professional who is interested in succeeding in their career?
Mine was to find Ben Finzel, actually. I interned at Fleischmann Hillard when Ben was there, when I first started my career, and I was so nervous to be out in the workplace, and I didn't know what this firm would be like. And Ben created an environment where I really could excel. And also Ben was the tip of the spear on Fleischmann Hillard out front, which, like he said at the start of this call, was one of the first LGBTQ practice groups for firms. And that was at a time when a lot of brands were worried a bit about marketing and including LGBTQ people in campaigns. So I think finding champions like Ben is amazing. And then I'm really happy that PRSA is having events like this. I think that helps. And the one other piece would be, as now career professionals, we should really look at our internships. It's something we've been working at GLAAD to really get our internships funded, so that we can pay these interns, because there are a lot of LGBTQ young people who can't take unpaid internships and work without getting paid. So I think as we think about the long-term pipeline and what we can do as career PR folks is try and find ways to start that pipeline young, and that's by getting interns. And you're going to need to pay a lot of LGBTQ people, young people and students to give them the experience so that they have the same opportunities.
That was great, Rich. I'm also thinking,
I think Coca-Cola is actually one of the funders of our youth program. So thank you.
Yay, yay. I'll take all the credit, Rich. I'll take as I think about, okay, first, Coca-Cola is the first company that I've been fully out in, okay? So I think we need to be kind to ourselves that everyone is on a journey that's their own. So don't feel pressured to be out and loud and all that. Just go at your own pace. I'll say that it took me a long time to come out professionally because I don't think people realize that, yes, you come out and people expect like you're just out, but there's many coming outs that happen all the time. And it's emotionally draining to have to explain it all the time, right? And I think that people don't recognize that. So just be kind to yourself first. That's my first piece of advice. I would say that additionally, you need to find resources that allow you to have people of color, gay people who are a little bit further in their career to help guide you. And one that comes to mind, and it's not necessarily just they support just specifically LGBTQ, but they support minorities in the industry of marketing, advertising, and PR. And that's the LeGrant Foundation. I know I always, people that know me, I always talk about this foundation because I would not be here today without scholarships. I'm the first in my family to graduate college. We did not have money, and education is the single most important piece for somebody to move out of poverty, a marginalized person to move out of poverty. And it's really important, even in the pandemic, as I think about it, for organizations like Coke and others to support financial support for marginalized communities, because it is the single most successful way to get out of poverty. Additionally, I think unfortunately, I think we're all familiar that we have to hustle really hard. I had 3+ jobs in college each year, to Rich's point, because I needed to have an unpaid internship and a paid job to ensure that I can make ends meet. And on top of that, with being involved in all those pieces, but what I'll say, sometimes it feels really, really hard. But now that I'm here, I feel like all those experiences have expedited and accelerated my ability to handle a lot of different things. And I'm not saying that, like you need to just go hard all the time. Take your time, but I think ultimately you need to find champions, like Rich said, and add us on LinkedIn. We're champions of talent, and I think that continuing to have conversations with people will be important. And I also want one add too. I think oftentimes people just like add people on LinkedIn, like add a personal message, like try and just go a little above and beyond, share an article, do something that shows that you actually did something more than just like click, connect, right? I think that's really important, because your personal ability to make a connection allows you to extend that relationship past the transactional relationship. I think that's really important too.
I'll just thank you, Rich, for what you said. I'll just say this question made me think of DC Family Communicators, which Troy mentioned at the outset. So this is a professional networking group I started. I run it myself. I'm not getting paid for it. We don't have any sponsors. The goal is to get more of us hired in DC. So if you're watching this webinar and you're a comms person in DC and you're LGBTQ, go to dcfamilycommunicators.com and look up our email address and send me a note and I'll add you. It's all about trying to find ways to connect us, build networks, and create opportunities to get more of us hired, because I think that is what leads to the change. I also made a list because that's what I do, I guess, I don't know. So just to build on the excellent things that Rich and Debbie said, I will say network as you go. Build a group of colleagues who can support you. That's really important. I mean, Debbie, I had like, goosebumps when you were talking, because it is hard, and it is a lot of coming out over and over again. And you need folks to help. Lift others up as you go up. That's really important, regardless of whether you are in your first job or you've had 6 jobs. Find ways to lift other people up as you go. It's going to be helpful, and it's going to make you feel better and make you be better. Find a way to speak out and speak up on some aspect of yourself in the industry. So think about how to brand yourself, and think about how you can bring your whole self to work when you're ready to do that, to Debbie's point a minute ago. And then 2 more, don't be so focused on yourself that you forget the opportunity you have to create space for more LGBT folks in the future. Try to do both. And that's easier said than done, particularly if you're in your first job, but just have that in mind. And then just a specific one, learn how to write, learn how to pitch, whether that's media or business, whatever it might be, and learn how to work well with others. So having the hard skills and the soft skills is really important to realizing that that's what's going to make you successful. And lastly, being a jerk is going to catch up with you, as much as not having the skills to succeed. So try to keep that in mind as well. And that goes back to the part about people supporting you. They can also tell you when you're being a jerk, and they can help you. So that's what I would think about.
That was all amazing advice. I know that our young PR pros who are tuning in definitely appreciate that. And I just want to double down on what Debbie said about education. I'm a firm believer that education is the economic equalizer. It doesn't matter what minority group you're from, if you're a person LGBT, a woman, if you're first gen, education is truly the economic equalizer, and through education, so many opportunities come to you. I'm gonna check the Q&A really quick. I know we are short on time, but I wanna make sure that we at least answer 1 or 2 of the Q&As before we leave. So I'm just gonna check that right now. One of the questions that I'm seeing for the panelists of companies that are doing well in addressing pride any one of you guys can answer that.
Yeah, and sorry, you are breaking up. I think the question was, what are good examples of companies doing well addressing pride through a Black Lives Matter lens, I think.
Yep, that's correct.
I saw this question come up, and I've been trying to think, and frankly, I think the answer is that no company is doing enough, and that it's a time, especially this Pride Month, when companies are not only doing external campaigns, but doing internal audits. And I think that's a really good move for companies to make sure that they're not just doing external campaigns, but that they're getting their house in order before they do that. That's something that's so important when you're reaching out to LGBTQ people, is to make sure that you have the right policies in place for your own employees, and make sure that you have welcoming and affirming workplaces, or if you're an external facing brand, that your stores and your websites are accessible to LGBTQ people. So I think this month there are brands that are doing it, and they need to, and we need brands to include LGBTQ people and to include Black LGBTQ people. But I think it's also this important time when brands are looking inside first. So I'm excited to see what's going to come from this moment, actually.
And I'll just add, I was watching the Oprah 2-day special that was on OWN and the Discovery networks a week or 2 ago. P&G had a whole series of ads which were like amazing. And I'm not paid by P&G. I'm just saying the ads were amazing. But I think, to the questioner, who's doing a good job with Black Lives Matter, lots of folks are saying a lot of nice things this month. That's great. But again, the proof is in the practice. So are they still going to be there 6 months from now? And are they going to actually be doing the things necessary? Are they going to do the audit and then actually put what they learn in the audit into practice? So I think the answer is we don't know yet, but I think we can be really hopeful that a lot of people have laid down a marker about what they're going to do. And hopefully we're going to see them, carry that through.
And I think additionally, in terms of just programming in general, you know, whether you are on Apple TV or Netflix, you're starting to see more and more programming with trans people as an example. And I think what's going to happen, just because, you know, again, things are like dominoes, is that brands are going to take heed of the change in the landscape of programming and gonna do more. I think that within Black Lives Matter, I think we need to continue, especially as part of the LGBTQ community, to say that Black trans lives matter. And I think anytime individually we can say that and collectively we can say that, I think it's really powerful. And I just don't want us to forget that, because I think that we owe it to the community to ensure that they are not forgotten. It's so important. It's so, so important.
There's a great documentary on Netflix that premiered last week called Disclosure, about the history of images of trans people in the media and about why that matters and who trans people are today. Laverne Cox is the executive producer. Watch it if you want to learn more about trans people, and if you just want to watch a really powerful and wonderful documentary.
Well, that was amazing, guys. I know that we have to wrap, so I want to thank you, Rich, Debbie, Ben. Thank you guys for being able, appreciate it, especially during these times. I want to encourage the audience, people who tuned in, feel free to add us on LinkedIn if you would like to have a conversation or if you would like any additional advice. And I thank everybody for tuning in tonight.
Thank you, PRSA. Thank you, Troy. Bye, Debbie. Bye, Rich.
Yes,
Bye,
thank
guys.
you, PRSA.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you, PRSA.